Welcome to Shaping Asia's Future. I'm Arnold Gay, coming to you from Global Intropolis at Singapore. It's impossible to talk about Asia's future without discussing the two countries that are primed to lead global growth, India and China. As the balance of power shifts to the east, the new world economy is expected to be led by Chindia, as the two economies are jointly called. The economic rise of India and China has been watched with mixed emotions. Together, both countries make up 1/3 of the world's population and have enough to power worldwide growth. Business Week predicts that within 3 decades, India will overtake Germany as the world's 3rd largest economy. And by mid-century, China would have vaulted over the United States as the #1 economy. By then, both countries would account for half of the world's output. China and India are even changing the game over a spectrum of industries. China is dominant in mass manufacturing and is continuing to build multi-billion-dollar electronics and heavy industrial plants, while India is a rising power in software, design and services. Let's get more perspective from our panel of guests. Dr. James Canton is Chairman and Chief Executive, Institute for Global Futures, and Christopher Graves is President and Chief Executive, Asia Pacific for Ogilvy Public Relations Worldwide. James, I want to start by asking you about the rise of India and China. A lot has been said about how they will be the future superpowers of the world. A lot has been said about how they may integrate together and form Chindia, if you like. What kind of an impact are they having right now, and where are they in terms of achieving this kind of impact?
I think each China and India represents is an enabling force of innovation and if you will, economic prosperity. I'm very hopeful about it. I think it portends for, yes, some bumps and challenges, but I think it sends a signal around the world that they're quickly using innovation to be able to grow their economies, grow prosperity, and as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing. I think we want to get beyond the notion of competition. They don't need to win. You don't need to have winners and losers. There's going to be a collaborative, I think, emergence, a collaborative economy ultimately, and I think that economy will be perhaps driven by India and China working together. Right.
Chris, your sense of it, I think you're a little bit more optimistic about where they are in terms of their partnership.
Well, you know, nobody called it Japina. And you have Japan and China who have become enormous trading partners of each other. I think that that's just a natural thing that's already begun when you look at China and India in terms of intra-Asian trade between those two countries in particular. But I do think that there's a world of difference between the two, and they're not necessarily the stereotypical differences that people put forward. People ask, for example, they'll even set a date by the year 2032, India will catch and surpass China. I actually think that's bunk. I think that if you look at the core demographics, somebody like Clint Laurent has done this at Asian Demographics, where you look at the young India versus the older China. And the conclusion that a lot of people, most people are drawing is that China's going to get old and therefore, like Japan, it'll start shrinking. Whereas India, because it's young, will have more logs to throw on that productivity fire and keep growing. The problem is this, that all affluence comes from education. And if you look at the educational differences, they're stunning. You have a 60% literacy rate in India versus a 91% literacy rate in China. The amount of expenditure per pupil is huge in China versus India. And as you go forward, it's only more and more pressure on that poor educational infrastructure in India, where they have less and less pressure and more money per pupil going forward in China. So I would say if you come right on back to the demographics of agricultural, urban versus rural, and literacy rates, China is, in our lifetime, going to lead. That doesn't mean that India won't be huge. It will be huge.
Well, of course, the question is, you know, how will they lead? So I agree and disagree. So the demographic mix of China does tell an interesting story. For instance, 1.3 billion people, half of those, let's call it 700 million, are under the age of 25. You've got another 300 million that are under the age of 12. Well, you know, that's not necessary. That's the middle class in India today. So that represents, I think, a very interesting challenge. How do you get all those people educated? There's 1 million applications every year for Peking University alone. and they've got 17 campuses. There's 5 times as many chemists in China. Yet, I do think that, again, coming back to my particular area around innovation, I'm watching as a metric of change. I think that India and China will be doing different things.
One of the key differences between China and India is the amount of money that the Chinese government is spending on infrastructure, on education, on various other aspects to build up China. India, its current policies do not promote investment. It's spending its money on populist measures, subsidies for oil and subsidies for the people in an attempt to stay in power, if you like. Should the government realize that that's the problem and decides to invest in infrastructure in India, isn't that going to change the equation for Indians altogether?
I agree. I think that, again, you don't just spark innovation without high-level education. Yeah. And I do think that China does have the lead regarding that. I think the Indian policies, I mean, it's very interesting. Here you have the largest democracy in the world, and you've got the large, let's call it, managed economy in the world, in China. With certainly a lot more of the traditional liberalization and freedoms that you have in India than you have in China.
So if you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about starting up, what is the better environment? Actually, India becomes a more interesting environment for entrepreneurs because they have a friendlier capital system for entrepreneurs than China does. So you get the likes of an Infosys, get the likes of a Wipro, rather than a state-owned enterprise coming out of India. So despite the fact that they are really a 12th, say, of the amount of foreign direct investment, when you look at the internal use of capital, it's actually right now better to be an entrepreneur in India than it is in China.
2 other factors that are very important in terms of the economy in India, that India has as an edge over China right away. One is just, rule of law and IP protection, where I think that China is still struggling with that and has to really address these issues if they're going to be a magnet for growth. And India's done a fairly good job in that regard, and in some ways that's going to give them an edge, that rule of law. And it goes direct to where you want to set up your operations, how you want to set it up, do you feel comfortable in terms of intellectual property protection? Mm-hmm. I think that's a very significant issue that must be addressed.
James, what you're saying as well leads me to my next question, if you like, about the image that both countries the images that both countries have. Chris, you alluded to earlier, India, transparent, good guy, if you like. China, state-governed, state-owned, managed, if you like. Questions about where it's going, what it's going to do if it takes significant investments in other countries.
China scares the West more than India does. It understands it a lot less. And the language and the tone of the language that comes out of China Inc. as a brand scares them more than the language coming out of India Inc., for example. So there's a lot of work that China needs to do on how it speaks to the rest of the world, how it presents its brand to the rest of the world. I think the West is more naturally sympathetic to an India Inc. brand at this point, but I don't put it past China.
China's got this global brand image, if you will. Do business with us. Here's the meta message. Do business with us and get rich. And I think that that's very interesting. So I think they're going to be trading off. They're basically going to trade off transparency, if you will, and
for greed?
For greed, exactly. It's the Gordon Gekko paradigm of business. Now, I don't hear that out of India Inc., quite frankly. And also, I think that you can't have a America-centric perspective. America-centric perspective says we're afraid of China. Okay? The rest of the world says, hey, we want to get wealthy. We want to sell off our future oil assets or our copper assets because you're going to help us grow our economy. China's moved into Africa, Latin America. If you take a look at what they've done to protect their interests in energy alone, in terms of China Inc., it's been economically driven, and they're spreading around the cash. I think people will take money and exchange it for transparency.
I want to wrap it up very quickly by asking you, so is the rest of the world, particularly the United States, taking it all right, reacting in the right way to Chindia or independently India and China?
Well, my perspective is, as a global futurist, that it's all good. America needs to be, and Europe needs to be shaken up by the fast innovators and the agility coming out of India and China, and I'm happy for that. For me, it's a global innovation economy. The fact that they're going to now kick our butts, if you will, and get our economy going, I think that's good for everybody because it'll stimulate growth.
I think you see the natural resistance out of fear. There's always the fear part. It was toward Japan, and you've seen that now in the United States. You've seen that in Europe. Beyond economic, there are racial undertones of that. I think they've moved beyond that, or starting to move beyond that. And here's one sign why. The number of children, parents who are trying to find Mandarin language teachers and tutors in the US has gone through the roof. They are now recruiting for au pairs or nannies in China to come live in the US because they see that unless their kids speak Mandarin, their generation will speak Mandarin. They will be handicapped if they don't speak Mandarin. So I think that's one soft power sign that the message has gotten through.
All right, thank you. Dr. James Canton, Chairman and Chief Executive, Institute for Global Futures, and Christopher Graves, President and CEO, Asia Pacific for Ogilvy Public Relations Worldwide.